Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our series on the pastor's preaching ministry. I'm Steve Van Horn. I served as a pastor for 25 years and as an adjunct professor of preaching at the Nairobi International School of Theology, now International Leadership University. In this series, we are considering the pastor's preaching ministry. In the first video, we saw the priority of preaching and teaching. In the second video, we saw what is preaching. In this video, we're going to consider the goal or the purpose of preaching, followed by two more videos on the best form of preaching and the practice of preaching. So let's consider the goal or the purpose of preaching. God has a purpose for every life. God has a purpose for every church. God has a purpose for every family. And God has a purpose for the world. So if that's true, and it is, then he must have a purpose for preaching also, and he does. Without a clear purpose, the preacher will misuse the Bible, and many of them do. If the preacher's purpose is not God's purpose, then he's going to be working against God. And so to understand God's purpose for preaching, it's important that we first understand God's purpose for man. In a phrase, God's purpose for man is to become like Jesus. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, it says that God said, "Let us make man in our image." Man was created in the image of God, but then in Genesis chapter 3, Adam sinned, and the image of God in man was damaged. So since then, God's plan has been to restore his image in man. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 15 and 16, Peter writes, "But now you must be holy in everything that you do, just as God who chose you is holy." And the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 8, verse 29 wrote, "For God knew his people in advance, and he chose them to become like his Son." We were chosen by God to become like Jesus. And then 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18, Paul also writes, "So all of us who are followers of Christ, can see and reflect the glory of the Lord. And the Lord makes us more and more like him as we are changed into his glorious image." Then in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 24, Paul also writes that we are to put on our new nature, which was created to be like God, truly righteous and holy. And finally, in Matthew 28, verses 19 and 20, known as the Great Commission, or part of the Great Commission, Jesus said, "Therefore go and make disciples. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands that I have given you." And so in summary, Christians, the followers of Christ, are to think, act, and to feel like Jesus. And they are to learn to obey all of Christ's commands. That's the purpose for man. So with that in mind, what's the goal or the purpose of preaching? The goal or the purpose of preaching should be consistent with God's purpose for each life. And so I see that there are 5 goals of preaching. Number 1, to help the followers of Christ learn to think and act and to feel like Jesus. Secondly, to help the followers of Christ to live righteous and holy lives. Number 3, to help the followers of Christ to develop Christ-like convictions, Christ-like character, and Christ-like conduct. 4, to help the followers of Christ become doers of the word. James wrote in chapter 1 of his epistle, verse 22, "But don't just listen to God's word. You must do what it says. Otherwise, you are only fooling yourselves." And so preaching is to help followers of Christ become doers of God's word. And then number 5, to help the followers of Christ become mature in their faith. Paul wrote in Colossians chapter 1, verse 28, "So we tell others about Christ, warning and teaching everyone We want to present them to God perfect or mature in their relationship to Christ. So what is the purpose of preaching? The purpose of preaching is to help everyone who knows Christ be conformed to his image, to think and to live and to feel like Jesus, to be holy and righteous in their behavior, and to be mature in their faith. That's the purpose of preaching. And in the next video, we're going to consider the form of preaching that best accomplishes that purpose.